In May of 1963, a man named Carl Richter stood before the United States Senate. He was 50 years old. His hair had gone silver at the temples. His shoulders remained straight, despite the
We need to
weight of 2
talk.
decades spent
What is it?
proving he
I
deserved to
trust
be
you, but be
called an
careful.
American. The suit he wore was American. The flag pin on his lapel was American. Even his accent, though still carrying traces of Dresden, had been shaped by 18 years of choosing English over German at every opportunity. In his jacket pocket, folded into a square no larger than a playing card, was a letter. The paper had yellowed. The creases had worn thin. But the words remained as clear as the day they were written in February of 1945. The letter began with 4 simple words that had changed the course of his life. You deserve better food. The senators looked at him with polite attention. They did not yet know they were about to hear a story that would challenge everything they understood about enemies and Americans. They did not know that the man standing before them had once worn the uniform of the Wehrmacht, that he had commanded a panzer tank across France and Belgium, that he had believed with the certainty of youth and propaganda that Germany would triumph and reshape the world. They did not know that a Chinese-American soldier himself treated as an enemy by his own countrymen had fed this Nazi officer a meal that would ultimately help win the Cold War. Carl cleared his throat. The microphones picked up the sound. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter shifted in his seat, pen ready. Senators, Carl began, his voice steady. I want to tell you about February 19th, 1945, the day I learned what America truly means. The chamber fell silent, and Carl Richter, former enemy of the United States, began to speak. But to understand that day, we must first go back to the morning it happened. To the cold Pennsylvania dawn when 57 German prisoners of war lined up for breakfast, expecting nothing more than the watery oatmeal and stale bread that had sustained them through 4 months of captivity. The winter morning broke gray over Camp Allegiance. Snow from the previous night dusted the roofs of the wooden barracks. Smoke rose from the mess hall chimney, thin and tentative against the pale skeet bomb. Inside the barracks, men stirred at the sound of the wake-up bell. They moved with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers who had learned that routine was the only anchor in a world turned upside down by defeat and capture. Hauptmann Carl Richter, 32 years old, sat on the edge of his bunk and pulled on his boots. The leather was cracked, the soles were thin, but they were his boots, and he maintained them with the discipline his father had taught him. A soldier takes care of his equipment, even when the war is lost, even when the future is uncertain. Especially then. Around him, the other officers were waking. Werner Schmidt, 22 from Hamburg, Klaus Muller, 28 from Munich, Otto Braun, 35 from Cologne. Men who had believed they were fighting for something noble. Men who were learning slowly and painfully that belief is not the same as truth. Carl ran a hand through his dark blonde hair and stood. His back ached. The bunks were not designed for men over 6 feet tall. But complaining served no purpose. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. Adequate food, adequate shelter, adequate medical care. Adequate was not comfortable, but adequate was more than many prisoners in other countries received. He thought as he did every morning of his family in Dresden, his parents, his younger sister Emma, serving in the auxiliary corps somewhere in Germany, his brother Friedrich, 16 too young for service, but old enough to understand that their world was ending. Carl had not received mail in 5 months. The Red Cross promised letters were coming. Delayed by the chaos of a collapsing Reich. Delayed but not lost. He had to believe they were not lost. The prisoners filed out into the cold morning air. Breath steamed from their mouths. They formed ranks by habit, though no one had ordered them to do so. Some habits ran too deep to break. The American guards watched from a distance, rifles slung over shoulders. Professional but not cruel. Bored but not careless. One guard stood apart from the others. Private First Class James Chen, 28 years old, Chinese-American, from Chicago. Carl had noticed him months ago, partly because his face marked him as different from the other guards, and partly because something in his bearing suggested he understood what it meant to be seen as other, as foreign, as suspect. The guards did not fraternize with prisoners, but Carl had learned to read men by how they carried themselves. This Chen, he carried himself like someone who had something to prove, not to the prisoners, to his own countrymen. The prisoners marched to the mess hall. Their boots crunched on frozen ground. The building came into view, and Carl noticed something unusual. The windows were fogged more than normal. Steam pressed against the glass from the inside, as if someone had been cooking with more heat, more intensity than usual. The door opened. The prisoners filed inside. And Karl Richter, who had survived 3 years of war and 4 months of captivity, who prided himself on remaining unshaken by circumstances, stopped walking so abruptly that Werner Schmidt nearly collided with him from behind. The mess hall had been transformed. The long metal tables that normally stood bare and industrial were covered with white sheets. Not tablecloths exactly, too thin for that, but sheets pressed into service draped over the surfaces to create some approximation of civility, of care. But it was not the sheets that stopped Karl in his tracks. It was the food. Serving dishes lined the tables. Steam rose from them in visible columns, catching the morning light from the windows. The smell hit Karl like a physical force, sweet and sour, savory and complex, ginger and garlic, and something fried, something that made his empty stomach clench with a hunger he had been suppressing for months. This was not oatmeal. This was not the thin soup and hard bread they had come to expect. This was actual food, real food, the kind of food that required effort and skill, and most unsettling of all care. Karl's eyes tracked across the serving dishes. Chunks of meat glazed in a reddish-orange sauce. The meat was studded with pieces of pineapple, bright yellow against the dark glaze. Peppers, green and red, cut into perfect squares. The sauce caught the light. It looked almost sticky, rich, intentional. Another dish held mounds of rice, but not plain white rice. This rice was golden, dotted with vegetables, tiny pieces of egg, small shrimp. Each grain seemed separate, deliberate, not the clumped, overcooked mass they sometimes received. Golden rolls crispy and glistening with oil. Vegetables steamed but still bright green, maintaining their color, their life. Behind Karl, the other prisoners had stopped as well. 57 men stood frozen in the doorway, staring at a feast that made no sense. Enemies did not feed prisoners like this. Captors did not invest this kind of effort into people they were obligated to keep alive but not obligated to please. At the front of the hall, Lieutenant Frank Morrison stood with his arms crossed. Beside him, Private Chen stood at attention. But Karl noticed something in Chen's posture. A tension, an anticipation, as if he were waiting for something, watching for something. Lieutenant Morrison's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Gentlemen, Private Chen has prepared a traditional Chinese New Year feast to share with his camp. The holiday was last week on the 13th, but Private Chen needed time to prepare properly. Chinese New Year celebrates renewal, hope for better fortune in the coming year. You will sit, you will eat, you will show appropriate gratitude for the effort that has gone into this meal." His tone was firm, not warm exactly, but not hostile either. This was an order, but it was an order to receive kindness. Karl did not know how to process that. The prisoners moved to their seats slowly, uncertain. Some of the younger men glanced at the older officers seeking permission or guidance. Karl nodded. They would sit. They would eat. They would try to understand what this meant. American soldiers, including Chen, began serving the food. They moved down the rows of tables, placing generous portions on each prisoner's plate. Not measured, not rationed, generous. The word kept echoing in Karl's mind. This was generosity toward enemies. Why Karl sat at his usual place? A plate was placed before him. The food looked even more vibrant up close. The sauce on the pork caught the light. The rice steamed gently. The spring roll, still warm, released a visible wisp of heat when placed on his plate. He picked up his fork. The metal was cold in his hand. Around the hall, other prisoners were doing the same. Some hesitantly, some with barely concealed hunger, some with tears already forming in their eyes because this abundance, this care reminded them of homes they no longer had. Karl lifted a piece of the pork to his mouth. The meat was tender. The sauce coated his tongue, sweet from the pineapple, sour from vinegar, but balanced, not competing, harmonizing. Layers of flavor that revealed themselves slowly, ginger and garlic underneath, a hint of something else, soy sauce perhaps, or something Chinese he did not have words for. He chewed slowly. The texture was perfect, crispy on the outside, tender inside. This was not mass-produced food. This was cuisine. Someone had spent time on this, had cared about the result. Karl swallowed, reached for the rice. Each grain separated in his mouth. The egg added richness, the vegetables added texture, the small shrimp a burst of seafood flavor that reminded him painfully of summer vacations on the Baltic coast when he was a boy. Around the hall, the silence broke, not with conversation, with small sounds. Werner Schmidt bit into a spring roll and made a noise that was half surprise, half sob. Klaus Muller closed his eyes while chewing as if trying to memorize the sensation. Otto Braun set down his fork and covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking. These were not tears of sadness, exactly. These were tears of recognition, of remembering that the world contained beauty and care and effort, of realizing how much they had forgotten during years of war and months of imprisonment. Carl looked up from his plate. His eyes found Private Chen. The soldier was watching the prisoners eat, not with satisfaction exactly, more like hope, as if he were waiting to see if his gesture would be understood, received, valued. Their eyes met across the room. Carl did not speak, did not have the English words even if speaking were allowed. But he nodded, once, slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of something that might in time become respect. Chen nodded back, also once, also slowly. And in that moment something shifted in Carl Richter's understanding of the world. These Americans were not the decadent weaklings propaganda had described. They were not cruel oppressors gleefully starving their captives. They were something more complex, more dangerous to his old beliefs. They were human beings capable of generosity toward enemies. And that generosity was more powerful than any weapon. Carl returned to his meal. He ate slowly, savoring, remembering, and wondering what kind of country produced soldiers like James Chen. To understand the significance of that meal, we must understand the two soldiers who created it, the captor and the captive, the American and the German, both outsiders in their own ways, both searching for something they could not name. Carl Richter was born in Dresden in 1913, the son of a school teacher and a seamstress. His childhood was marked by poverty and pride. Germany, after the Great War, was humiliated, strangled by reparations. His father, who had served in the trenches, spoke often of honor lost and dignity denied. When the new government promised to restore German greatness, Carl believed. At 25, he enlisted, not out of bloodlust, out of duty, out of a desire to be part of something larger than his small life. He rose to the rank of Hauptmann, captain. He commanded men, led them through France, through Belgium, believed he was defending civilization itself. The propaganda was sophisticated. The lies were wrapped in truth. And Carl, like millions of others, could not see the evil underneath the appeals to patriotism and national revival. He fought well, survived battles that killed better men. And in December of 1944, during Germany's last desperate offensive in the Ardennes forest, his tank was destroyed by American artillery. The choice was clear: fight to the death as propaganda demanded, or surrender and live to see whatever came next. Carl chose to live. It was the first time he had ever disobeyed his training, the first crack in the foundation of his belief. The journey to America was long, 3 weeks in the hold of a transport ship, seasick and ashamed. When they sailed into New York Harbor, Carl stood on deck with hundreds of other prisoners. The Statue of Liberty rose from the water, her torch lifted toward the sky. An American guard near Carl laughed. "See that, boys? That's freedom, something you'll never have in Germany." The words stung because they might be true. James Chen was born in Chicago in 1917, the son of immigrants from Guangdong province. His parents spoke Cantonese at home, English in public. They ran a small restaurant in Chinatown, the Golden Phoenix. James grew up translating for his parents, navigating between two worlds, Chinese at home, American at school, never quite fitting perfectly in either. His grandmother, Chen Apor, lived with them, taught him to cook, taught him the importance of food as language, as communication. She would stand at the stove, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, and say in Cantonese, "Ah, why? When you cook for someone, you tell them I see you. I care that you are fed. Words can lie. Food cannot." Pearl Harbor changed everything. December 7th, 1941. James was 24 years old, working as a cook in his family's restaurant. The news spread through Chinatown like fire. Japan had attacked America, and suddenly every Asian face became suspect. Customers stopped coming. Windows were broken. Graffiti appeared on the walls. Japs go home. It did not matter that James's family was Chinese, that China and Japan were enemies, that the Chen family had been in America for nearly 20 years. To most Americans, Asian was Asian. Enemy was enemy. James enlisted the next day, walked into the recruitment office with his birth certificate and his high school diploma. The officer looked at him with barely concealed skepticism. "You sure you're not Japanese, son?" "I'm Chinese, sir, American citizen, born in Chicago, and I want to fight." The officer processed his papers, but James quickly learned that wanting to fight and being allowed to fight were different things. Boot camp was an education in prejudice. The slurs were constant: Jap, slant eyes, Charlie. It did not matter how many times James corrected them, how many times he outperformed them in marksmanship or tactical exercises. His face marked him as other. He was assigned to the quartermaster corps, not combat, cooking, supply, far from the front lines. He understood a kind of imprisonment, not as brutal as the Japanese internment camps, but still a cage. Then in January of 1945, he was transferred to Camp Allegiance to guard and feed German prisoners of war. The irony was not lost on him. He, an American soldier who looked like the enemy guarding white Europeans who actually were the enemy, but looked more American than he did. His grandmother wrote to him every week. Her letters were in Chinese characters that James had to translate slowly. She reminded him of their family's values, of the importance of maintaining dignity even when denied respect. And in one letter, she wrote something that would change the course of James's life and the life of at least one German prisoner. She wrote, "Why, you say the German prisoners are treated adequately, but adequate is not the same as good. Remember what I taught you. Food is how we show humanity, even to enemies, especially to enemies, because enemies do not stay enemies forever, but how you treat them determines what they become when the enmity ends." James read that letter in his barracks, thought about the German prisoners eating their bland oatmeal and thin soup, thought about the discrimination he faced daily from his own countrymen, and made a decision. Chinese New Year had just passed, February 13th, a time for renewal, for sweeping away old misfortunes and welcoming new possibilities. His grandmother always prepared a feast, always shared it with anyone who entered her restaurant, rich or poor, Chinese or not, because feeding people was how the Chen family understood love. James requested permission to speak with Lieutenant Morrison. The commander was a practical man, Texas rancher before the war, believed in rules but also believed rules should serve purpose, not merely exist for their own sake. James stood at attention in Morrison's office. "Sir, request permission to prepare a special meal for the camp, Chinese New Year tradition. Include the prisoners." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studied James for a long moment. "Why would you want to feed Nazis better than regulations require private?" "Not about them, sir. About us. About showing what America means. My grandmother always said, when you feed someone, you're saying, I see you as human. If we treat them like animals, we become what they think we are." Morrison considered. This was unusual, unprecedented even. But something about Chen's sincerity, his quiet determination made Morrison nod. "Approved. But you source ingredient as yourself, no extra budget, and you keep it simple. No exceptions to security protocols." James saluted. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." He wrote to his grandmother that night, explained what he wanted to do, asked for supplies. Her response arrived within a week, a large package containing dried mushrooms, special sauces, rice paper for spring rolls, and her handwritten recipe for sweet and sour pork, the dish that had made the Golden Phoenix famous in Chicago's Chinatown. Her letter said simply, "I am proud of you, Awai. Feed them well. Show them what kindness looks like. Even enemies deserve to know that good people exist in the world." James spent 3 days preparing. The camp kitchen became his laboratory. He worked during his off-duty hours, chopping vegetables with the precision his grandmother had taught him, mixing sauces in carefully measured proportions, soaking rice, testing flavors. The camp cooks watched with amused curiosity as this Chinese-American private transformed military rations and care package ingredients into something that actually smelled appetizing. But not everyone approved. Sergeant Bull Henderson was 42 years old, Texas native, veteran of the North Africa campaign. He had lost his younger brother at Kasserine Pass, killed by German artillery. Bull hated every prisoner in Camp Allegiance with a hatred that was pure and uncomplicated. They were the enemy. They deserved nothing beyond what the Geneva Convention mandated. On February 18th, the day before the feast, Bull found James in the kitchen. The smell of ginger and garlic filled the air. James was preparing spring rolls, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Bull leaned against the doorframe. His expression was cold. "You're wasting good food on Krauts." James did not look up from his work. "Following Lieutenant Morrison's orders, Sergeant." Morrison's soft. "Always has been. But you're different. And you weren't even allowed to fight. You're just a cook. And now you're cooking fancy meals for the bastards who killed my brother. Explain that to me, Chen." James set down the spring roll he was forming. Met Bull's eyes. "Your brother died fighting Germans, Sergeant. I respect that sacrifice. But we're not feeding them because they deserve it. We're feeding them because we're better than they are. That's what makes us Americans." Bull's jaw tightened. "Easy for you to say. You got nothing invested in this war. You're not even really American." The words hung in the air between them. James felt the familiar sting, the familiar anger. But his grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. Dignity even when denied respect. "I am American, Sergeant. Born in Chicago. Served my country the best they'd let me. And tomorrow I'm going to show these prisoners what American values actually look like. Not through bullets, through kindness. Because that's more powerful than any weapon." Bull stared at him for a long moment, then spat on the floor and walked away. James returned to his work. His hands trembled slightly, but he did not stop. Could not stop. Because tomorrow, February 19th, 1945, he would serve a meal that would change the trajectory of at least one life. Maybe more. Maybe in ways he could not yet imagine the trajectory of history itself. In his barracks that night, Carl Richter sat on his bunk and read over a letter he had written months ago. Back in December before Christmas, he had composed it during a moment of hope. The Red Cross had promised mail service would resume soon. He had written to Emma describing camp life, asking about the family. He had kept the letter waiting for the right time to send it. Now in mid-February, he finally sealed it and addressed it carefully. The letter began, "Liebste Emma, dearest Emma, I hope this finds you safe." He described camp life, the adequate conditions, the professional guards, the bland food. He did not mention the loneliness, did not mention the nightmares about burning tanks and screaming men, did not mention the growing suspicion that everything he had believed about the war was a lie. He wrote, "The Americans are not what we were told. They are not weak. They are not cruel. They are simply indifferent. We are numbers to them. Obligations. I wonder what happens when the war ends. Do we return to rubble? Do we stay here as eternal prisoners? The future seems as blank as the Pennsylvania winter sky." He signed it, "Your brother Carl." He did not know that his sister Emma was already dead, that she had died on February 13th, just days earlier in the firebombing of Dresden. Along with their parents, along with Friedrich, along with 25,000 other souls consumed in a storm of fire and wind. He did not know that this letter written in December with hope would be returned to him in late April with the stamp, "Addressee deceased." He did not know that on February 19th, the day after he sealed this letter, he would eat a meal prepared by a Chinese-American soldier and experience generosity that would fundamentally alter his understanding of enemies and Americans. He placed the letter in the envelope, addressed it carefully, and laid down on his bunk to sleep, unaware that everything was about to change. The first bite changed Carl Richter's understanding of the enemy, but understanding, he would learn, was only the beginning. True transformation required something deeper, something more painful. It required confronting not just what he had lost, but what he had been part of, what he had enabled, what his silence and service had cost the world. But that reckoning would come later. First came the meal. James Chen and two other guards moved down the rows of tables, serving generous portions onto each prisoner's plate. The portions were not measured. not calculated to meet exact caloric requirements and nothing more. These were the portions of someone who believed that feeding people well was an act of respect, of recognition. Carl watched as his plate filled, the sweet and sour pork glossy with sauce, the chunks of meat perfectly sized, the fried rice each grain distinct, the spring roll still warm enough that steam escaped from its golden wrapper, vegetables that had been steamed but not boiled into submission, everything arranged with care, with intention. Around the hall, 57 German prisoners sat in various states of disbelief. Some stared at their plates as if the food might disappear if they looked away. Others had already begun eating their forks, moving with the urgency of men who had forgotten what abundance tasted like. A few of the older officers maintained rigid postures, trying to preserve dignity in the face of unexpected generosity. But their eyes betrayed them. Hunger, gratitude, confusion. Werner Schmidt, the young private from Hamburg, sat across from Karl. He was 22 years old, had been in the war less than a year before capture, still carried himself like a boy pretending to be a soldier. He picked up his fork, cut into the spring roll, bit down. The crispy wrapper shattered between his teeth. Inside, the filling was hot and savory, cabbage and pork and something else he could not identify. The textures played against each other, crisp and soft, simple and complex. Werner chewed slowly, his eyes closed, and then without warning, tears began streaming down his face. He set down his fork, covered his mouth with his hand. His shoulders shook. Karl reached across the table, placed a hand on Werner's wrist, said nothing. There were no words that would help. The boy was crying because the spring roll reminded him of his mother's cooking, of Sunday dinners before the war, of a world where food was prepared with love and eaten in safety. Werner wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Entschuldigung, Hauptmann. Sorry, Captain. His voice was thick. I have not tasted anything so good since before I left home. Karl squeezed the boy's wrist once, released it. It is good to remember that good things still exist in the world, even here, even now. He turned his attention to his own plate, lifted a piece of the pork to his mouth. The meat was tender, had been cooked with precision. The sauce coated his tongue, sweet from pineapple. The fruit had been cut into perfect chunks, sour from vinegar, but not too sour, balanced. Underneath there was ginger, garlic, soy sauce. The flavors layered in ways that German cuisine never attempted. German food was hearty, substantial, honest. This was something else. This was cuisine that required technique and care and time. Karl chewed slowly, savored, tried to understand why an American soldier would invest this much effort in defeating enemy prisoners. There had to be a reason, a strategy. Maybe this was psychological warfare. Make them comfortable, make them compliant, soften them for interrogation. But even as he thought it, he knew it was wrong. This was not strategy. This was something personal, something that came from belief rather than orders. He swallowed, reached for the fried rice, each grain separated perfectly in his mouth. The egg added richness. The tiny pieces of vegetables added color and texture. Small shrimp no larger than his thumbnail burst with flavor. This rice had been cooked by someone who knew exactly how rice should be prepared. Who cared that it be done correctly? Around the hall, the initial silence had broken. Not into conversation exactly. The prisoners were not allowed to speak freely during meals, but into small sounds, forks on plates, quiet exclamations in German, the occasional sharp intake of breath when someone tasted something unexpected, something beautiful. Klaus Muller, sitting to Karl's right, ate with his eyes closed. Each bite was deliberate, ceremonial. He had been a carpenter before the war, a man who worked with his hands, who understood the difference between adequate and excellent. When he opened his eyes, they were wet, but he was smiling. Whoever made this, Klaus said quietly in German, loves cooking. You can taste it. The care, this is not duty, this is craft. Karl nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. Food like this could not be faked, could not be produced through mere obligation. Someone had spent hours in the kitchen, had tested flavors, had adjusted and refined until everything was exactly right. That kind of dedication came from passion, from belief that the act of cooking for others mattered. He looked up from his plate, scanned the hall until he found Private Chen. The soldier stood near the serving area watching the prisoners eat. His expression was hard to read, not satisfaction exactly, more like hope, like he was waiting to see if his message had been received, if the prisoners understood what he was trying to tell them. Their eyes met again. Carl set down his fork, placed both hands flat on the table, bowed his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, of something that in another context might have been called gratitude. Chen's expression softened. He nodded back. Once. Slowly. And Carl understood. This was not about food. This was about humanity. About one man telling 57 other men across the divide of war and language and enmity that they were still human beings, still worthy of care, still deserving of something better than mere survival. The meal continued. Prisoners cleaned their plates. Some asked for seconds. The guards served them without comment, without judgment. When Carl finished his portion, he sat back in his chair and realized that for the first time in months he felt full, not just in his stomach, in some deeper place that had been hollow since the moment he surrendered. After the meal ended, after the prisoners had been dismissed back to their barracks for the morning work detail, Carl found himself walking toward the kitchen. He did not have permission to be in this area, but he needed to speak to Private Chen, needed to understand why this American soldier had done this thing. The kitchen was at the back of the mess hall. Steam still rose from the sinks where dishes were being washed. Carl stood in the doorway. Chen was inside his back to the entrance, sleeves rolled up, hands immersed in soapy water. Another guard, a corporal, stood nearby, watchful. Carl cleared his throat. Private, Chen turned. Water dripped from his hands. His expression was neutral, careful. Hauptmann Richter, you need something. Carl's English was limited, broken, but he had been practicing with the other prisoners who spoke it better, piecing together phrases. He gestured toward the dining hall behind him. The food. Why you do this? Why for us? Chen dried his hands on a towel, considered his answer. The corporal shifted his weight, ready to intervene if necessary. But Chen shook his head slightly. It was fine. My grandmother, Chen began. His voice was quiet, measured. She came to America from China in 1923. She always tells me when you cook for someone, you say to them, I see your humanity. You are worth my time, my effort, my care. He paused, looked directly at Carl. You are prisoners. You are Germans. You fought for things I believe are evil, but you are also men, far from home, scared, hungry, and those things, those are universal. So I cooked. Carl struggled to process the English, to translate it into German in his mind, to understand not just the words, but the meaning underneath. But we are enemy. Yes, Chen said, you are, but after Pearl Harbor, Americans looked at me and saw enemy too. Because of my face, because I am Chinese and they could not tell the difference between Chinese and Japanese. I am American, born in Chicago, but they see enemy. So I understand what it feels like when people see you as other, as less than human. I do not want to be that person to you. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward. Carl had not considered this, that the American guards might themselves be suffering, might themselves understand what it meant to be judged, to be reduced to something less than your full humanity. He opened his mouth to respond, could not find words in English adequate to what he felt. Switched to German. Ich verstehe nicht. I do not understand, then switching back to broken English. You are American, you win, you have power. Why you care what we think? Chen was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried weight. History. Because power without mercy is just tyranny. America is supposed to be different, better. Not because we are stronger, because we are kinder, because we choose to see humanity even in enemies. If we lose that, we lose what makes us American. Carl felt something shift behind him. A foundation he had not known was unstable, suddenly cracking. He had been taught that America was weak, decadent, that their democracy made them soft, incapable of the hard decisions necessary for survival. But this soldier standing in a military kitchen with dishwater dripping from his hands, was describing strength of a different kind, a strength that came from choice rather than compulsion, from generosity rather than domination. "Thank you," Carl said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had, for the food, for seeing us. Chen nodded. "You are welcome." Carl turned to leave. Stopped, looked back. "Your grandmother. She is wise woman." "Yes," Chen said. A small smile touched his face. "She is." Carl walked back to the barracks, his mind churned with thoughts he could not organize, questions he could not answer. He had believed he understood the war, understood the enemy, understood what was at stake. But this meal, this conversation suggested that his understanding had been built on propaganda and lies. If Americans could be this kind, this generous, this principled, what did that say about the cause he had fought for? What did it say about Germany? The questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside. There would be time to think later. Now there was work detail, routine. The small tasks that filled the hours and kept the mind from dwelling too long on uncomfortable truths. But the questions did not go away. They festered, grew. And when the letter arrived 2 months later, they would explode into a crisis that would force Karl Richter to confront everything he had believed about himself and his country. In the camps across America during the winter of 1945, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners were being held. Most were German, some were Italian, a handful were Japanese. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Never before had one nation held so many enemy soldiers on its own soil. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, medical care, but adequate was open to interpretation. Some camps provided the bare minimum. Others, like Camp Allegiance, went further, not out of softness, out of strategic calculation. Well-treated prisoners were less likely to riot, less likely to attempt escape, more likely to cooperate. But there was another reason. A reason that was rarely discussed in official reports, but understood by soldiers like Lieutenant Morrison and Private Chen. These prisoners would eventually return home. They would rebuild Germany, rebuild Italy, rebuild Japan. And how America treated them now would shape how they remembered America later, would shape what kind of world emerged from the ashes of this war. Kindness was not weakness. It was investment. It was choosing to plant seeds that might not grow for years, decades. But when they did grow, they would grow into something that no amount of military force could create. They would grow into genuine respect, into admiration, into a desire to emulate rather than resist. James Chen understood this instinctively. His grandmother had taught him, every person you feed might become an ambassador for your values. Every act of generosity is a stone dropped into water. The ripples spread further than you can see. The feast on February 19th was one such stone. The ripples were about to begin. If you served in the military during World War II and encountered German or Japanese prisoners, share your story in the comments below. Your generation understood something profound about how to turn enemies into allies, something we are in danger of forgetting. And if you want to know what happened when Karl Richter learned the truth about his family and his country, keep watching. Because the story gets harder, more painful, but also more important. Late April 1945. The snow had melted. Spring was coming to Pennsylvania. The ground was soft, muddy. The prisoners worked outdoor details, clearing drainage ditches, repairing fences, physical labor that kept their bodies strong and their minds occupied. At 1400 hours, Lieutenant Morrison called assembly in the recreation hall. The prisoners filed in curious. Assemblies outside the regular schedule usually meant news, maybe about the war, maybe about repatriation procedures. Morrison stood at the front of the hall with a mail bag. The Red Cross had delivered a large shipment, letters that had been delayed for months in the chaos of the collapsing Reich. Some letters had been written as early as November, had taken 5 months to cross the Atlantic, to wind their way through military postal systems, to finally arrive at this small camp in rural Pennsylvania. "Mail call," Morrison said. His voice was neutral, professional, but there was something underneath, attention. He knew what some of these letters would contain, knew that for many prisoners the news would not be good. He began calling names alphabetically, each name followed by a moment of silence. Then the sound of boots on the wooden floor as a prisoner walked forward to claim his letter. Some letters were thick, multiple pages, some were thin, a single sheet. The thickness often indicated the content. Thick meant detail. Description: life continuing at home. Thin meant bad news delivered quickly, efficiently. Richter Carl. Carl stood, his heart hammered in his chest. 5 months since his last letter. 5 months of not knowing if his family was alive. Safe. He walked to the front of the hall. Morrison handed him an envelope, then another. Two for you, Hauptmann, one addressed to you, one addressed to Emma Richter. Return to sender. Carl took both envelopes, looked at the second one, his own handwriting, the letter he had sealed in February, the night before the feast, stamped across the front in red ink, addressee deceased. His hands began to shake. He returned to his seat, set the returned letter on the bench beside him, opened the first envelope. The return address was from Aunt Helga, his mother's sister, who lived in the suburbs outside Dresden. Away from the city center, he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was cramped, hasty, as if she had written quickly, wanting to be done with the terrible task. The letter was in German. Carl's eyes scanned the words. Each sentence was a hammer blow. Dearest Carl, I write with news I wish I did not have to deliver. On the night of February 13th, Allied bombers attacked Dresden. The firebombing was total. Your parents were visiting friends in the Altstadt that night. Emma had come home on leave. She wanted to see the family. Friedrich was there too, to spend a few days in the house where they grew up. The building was destroyed completely. There are no bodies to recover. They simply vanished in the fire, along with 25,000 others, maybe more. No one can count. The city burned for days. I am sorry, Carl. You are now alone in the world. I have my own family to care for. 3 children. My husband was injured in the air raids. I cannot take you in when you return. I hope you understand. May God have mercy on all of us for what we have become. The letter ended there. No signature. Just the date, March 1st. Carl read it twice. 3 times. The words refused to make sense, refused to arrange themselves into a reality he could accept. His parents, dead. Emma, dead. Friedrich, dead. February 13th. That was 6 days before the feast. 6 days before he had eaten sweet and sour pork and smiled. 6 days before he had felt something like hope. For the first time in months, while he was eating, while he was experiencing kindness from an enemy, while he was allowing himself to believe that the world still contained good things. His family was burning, screaming, dying in a storm of fire that consumed an entire city. The envelope slipped from his hands, fell to the floor. He sat motionless, staring at nothing. Around him, other prisoners were reading their own letters, some laughing with relief, some crying with grief. The sounds came from far away, distant, unreal. Werner Schmidt, sitting beside him, picked up the fallen letter. Read it. His face went pale. Hauptmann, I am so sorry. Carl did not respond, could not respond. His mind had gone blank, white, empty. All the questions he had been asking himself since the feast. All the doubts about the war, about Germany, about what he had fought for. They all collapsed into a single unbearable truth. His family was dead, killed by American bombs. By the enemy who had just fed him the best meal of his life. By the people who had shown him kindness. And he did not know how to feel. Did not know if he should hate them or thank them or simply cease to exist, because existing in a world where these contradictions could coexist was too much to bear. He stood, walked out of the recreation hall. No one stopped him. The guards had seen this before, had seen men receive news that shattered them. They knew to give space, to let the grief happen. Carl walked to the barracks, sat on his bunk, stared at the wall. Time passed. He did not notice, did not care. The world had ended on February 13th. He had just not known it until now. Carl Richter did not eat for 3 days, did not speak, did not leave the barracks except when forced by work detail. He moved through the hours like a ghost, present but not alive. His eyes were open but saw nothing. The other prisoners gave him space. They understood grief. Many of them carried the same weight, the same terrible knowledge that the world they had known was gone, burned, buried, lost. On the evening of the third day, Lieutenant Morrison made a decision. He found James Chen in the kitchen preparing the evening meal. Standard fare. Nothing like the feast. Just boiled potatoes and canned vegetables. Adequate nutrition. Nothing more. Morrison stood in the doorway. "Private Chen, I need you to talk to Hauptmann Richter." James looked up from the potatoes he was peeling. "Sir, he received news 3 days ago. Lost his entire family in the Dresden firebombing. Parents, sister, brother. He has not eaten since. Will not speak. Dr. Patterson says physically he is fine, but mentally he is somewhere else. I think you might be able to reach him." James set down the peeling knife. "Sir, I do not speak German, and he barely speaks English. Grief does not need translation. Private, you showed him kindness when no one else did. Maybe that earns you the right to sit with him now. I am ordering you to treat him." James dried his hands, removed his apron. "Yes, sir." The barracks were dim when James entered. Late afternoon light filtered through the windows. Carl sat on his bunk, back against the wall, knees drawn up, staring at nothing. The other prisoners were outside for evening recreation. The barracks was empty except for the two of them. James sat on the bunk across from Carl. Did not speak immediately, just sat. Let the silence settle. Let Carl register his presence without pressure to respond. After a long moment, James spoke. "Hauptmann, I heard about your family. I am sorry." Carl did not turn his head, did not acknowledge the words, but his jaw tightened, a muscle twitched, some sign that he had heard, that he was still present enough to process language. James continued, "I do not know if this helps, but my sister, her name is Lily. She almost died from pneumonia 2 years ago. For 3 days, I thought she was gone. I lived in a world where she was dead. That feeling, it is like the ground disappears beneath you, like everything you believed was a lie." Still nothing from Carl, but his breathing changed, became less shallow, less automatic. "Your family died from American bombs," James said. His voice was quiet, steady, not apologizing but not defending either, just stating fact. "I am sorry for that. War does terrible things, makes us all complicit in horrors we would never choose if given the option." Carl spoke. His voice was rough from disuse. Broken. "They die February 13. I eat your food February 19. I smile. I laugh. I do not know they burn." The words were fragments, English tortured by grief and limited vocabulary. But the meaning was clear. The guilt was crushing him. The terrible coincidence of joy and death happening simultaneously, of being grateful while his family was dying. James leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You did not know, could not have known. And even if you did, eating does not dishonor their memory. Surviving does not dishonor them. You are allowed to live even when they died." "American bombs killed them," Carl said. His eyes finally moved. Found James. There was rage there, but also confusion. "You are American. You feed me. You are kind. But your country killed my family. How I understand this?" James took a breath. "I cannot make sense of it for you. War is not clean, not simple. Your family died in bombing raid that was meant to destroy factories, railways, military infrastructure. But those bombs also killed civilians, thousands of them. That is war. That is the terrible mathematics of trying to end evil quickly rather than letting it continue slowly." "Evil," Carl repeated. The word seemed to catch in his throat. "You think Germany is evil? I think your government was evil, the Nazi regime, what they did to Jewish people, to Roma, to anyone who disagreed, that was evil. But you sitting here grieving your family, you are not evil. You are just a man who fought for his country without knowing the full truth of what that country had become." Carl closed his eyes. "I serve evil and I do not know. That make me stupid, or coward, or both." "It makes you human," James said. "Propaganda is powerful. Lies wrapped in patriotism are hard to see through, especially when everyone around you believes the same lies. You cannot judge yourself by what you did not know, only by what you do now that you know." They sat in silence. The light shifted, evening deepening into dusk. Finally, Carl spoke again. "Why you care if I live or die? If I eat or starve, I am enemy. My country ally with Japan. Japan attack your country. You should hate me. James considered his answer carefully. After Pearl Harbor, Americans looked at my face and saw Japan, saw enemy. Did not matter that I am Chinese, that my family has been in America for 20 years. Did not matter that I enlisted to fight. They saw enemy. So I understand what it feels like to be judged for things beyond your control, to be reduced to less than your full humanity. I do not want to be that person to you. I want to be better. America is supposed to be better. Carl opened his eyes, studied James for a long moment. You believe that America is better. I believe America tries to be better, does not always succeed, but tries. That is something. That is worth fighting for. Not the America that exists, but the America that could exist if we lived up to our own values. Carl was silent for another long stretch. Then he swung his legs off the bunk, stood, walked to the window, looked out at the Pennsylvania countryside, green and peaceful, so different from the devastated landscapes of Europe. When war ends, he said quietly, I have nowhere to go, no family, no home. Dresden is destroyed. Germany is destroyed. I am alone. James stood, joined him at the window. Then maybe you stay here, start over, become something new. Carl turned, looked at him. Why would America let me stay I am enemy? Because America is supposed to be land of second chances, of new beginnings. That is what my grandmother always tells me. That is why she came here from China. Not because America was perfect, because it was possible. Here you can become more than what you were meant to be. Carl stared at him, processing. Then slowly he nodded. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. The seed of an idea taking root. I think about it, he said. After war ends, I think about it. James nodded. Good. That is good. But first you need to eat. Come, I saved you portion from dinner. Potatoes are cold, but they are food. Carl hesitated, then followed James out of the barracks. It was a small step, but it was a step. Movement toward life rather than death, toward future rather than past. 2 weeks later, in late March, Lieutenant Morrison assembled all prisoners in the recreation hall. His expression was grave. Sergeant Bull Henderson stood beside him. Several other guards lined the walls. The atmosphere was heavy, serious. Gentlemen, Morrison began, what I am about to show you will be difficult to see, but you need to see it, need to know what your country did, what you fought to defend. He gestured to the projector that had been set up at the back of the room. The lights dimmed. The projector clicked to life. Images appeared on the screen. Photographs taken by American soldiers who had liberated concentration camps across Germany and Poland. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. The images were grotesque, skeletal prisoners barely alive, mountains of corpses, gas chambers, ovens designed for industrial-scale murder. Evidence of medical experiments, of systematic cruelty that defied comprehension. The prisoners sat in stunned silence. Some denied it immediately. Allied propaganda, lies designed to justify their defeat. But most recognized truth when they saw it. The photographs were too detailed, too numerous, too specific. This was real. This had happened, was still happening. Werner Schmidt ran from the room. The sound of vomiting came from the hallway. Other young prisoners followed, unable to process what they were seeing. Klaus Muller sat rigid, face pale, hands gripping the edge of the bench so hard his knuckles went white. Carl watched everything, every photograph, every piece of evidence. His mind worked through implications with mechanical precision. This was what he had fought for. This was what his service had enabled. He had not known. But not knowing did not erase complicity, did not absolve guilt. When the presentation ended, Morrison turned on the lights. His voice was steady but hard. These camps were not military targets, were not casualties of war. These were deliberate, organized atrocities committed against civilians whose only crime was being Jewish, or Roma, or homosexual, or mentally ill, or politically opposed to the Nazi regime. Millions dead, millions more traumatized beyond healing. He paused, let the information sink in. Some of you will say you did not know. Maybe that is true. But you served a regime that did this. You wore its uniform. You fought its wars. You enabled this. And now you know, now you must decide what kind of man you will be with this knowledge. Carl stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. Lieutenant Morrison, permission to speak. Morrison nodded. Granted. Carl's English had improved over the months. He spoke slowly but clearly. My parents died in fire caused by war, Germany started. My sister served auxiliary, typing reports, transmitting orders. Maybe those orders helped run these camps. Friedrich, my brother, he was just boy. But he believed propaganda. We all believed. And I drove tanks. Defended regime that built factories of death. We are not victims. We are accomplices. The words hung in the air. Other prisoners shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded, others looked away, unable to accept the verdict Carl had passed on himself, on all of them. I do not know what I do with this knowledge, Carl continued, but I know I cannot go back to Germany and pretend I did not see. Cannot rebuild country on foundation of lies. Cannot be German in same way I was German before. He sat down, the weight of the revelation crushing him. Morrison watched him for a long moment, then nodded, dismissed the assembly. That night, Carl lay in his bunk and tried to reconcile everything he now knew. His family had died as consequence of a war started by evil men pursuing evil goals. He had fought for those men, had believed their lies, had enabled, however unknowingly, the machinery of genocide. And the Americans whose bombs had killed his family were also the people who had liberated the camps, who had stopped the killing, who had shown him kindness when they had every reason to hate him. There was no clean narrative. No simple story where he was purely victim or purely villain. He was both. He was neither. He was a man who had made choices based on incomplete information and must now live with the consequences of those choices. The only path forward was to choose differently, to become something other than what he had been, to prove, if only to himself, that knowledge could lead to transformation, that guilt could lead to redemption. When morning came, Carl knew what he would do. He would stay in America, would rebuild his life in the country of his former enemies, would spend whatever years remained proving that even men who served evil could learn, could change, could become advocates for the values they once fought against. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. At Camp Allegiance, the American Guards celebrated, hung bunting, played music over the loudspeakers, drank beer that Lieutenant Morrison had somehow acquired despite regulations against alcohol on military installations. The German prisoners did not celebrate. They sat in the barracks or wandered the compound in small groups, talking quietly, trying to understand what surrender meant for their futures. Most assumed they would be repatriated, sent back to Germany through displaced persons camps, back to a country that no longer existed as they had known it, to cities reduced to rubble, to families that might or might not still be alive. Carl had different plans. He requested a formal meeting with Lieutenant Morrison, stood at attention in the commander's office while Morrison reviewed paperwork at his desk. Hauptmann Richter, what can I do for you? Sir, I wish to request information about alternative to repatriation. Morrison looked up, set down his pen. Alternative, you want to stay here as a prisoner. Not as prisoner, sir, as immigrant. I wish to apply for United States immigration status. I have no family in Germany, no home, nothing. But here I have learned what America means. I wish to be part of it. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studied Carl for a long moment. This is unusual, unprecedented even. You understand that you would need an American sponsor, a citizen willing to vouch for you, provide employment, help you integrate into society. Yes, sir, I understand. And you understand that many Americans will not trust you, will see you as enemy for rest of your life, that you will face discrimination, suspicion, hatred even. Yes, sir, I understand all of this. But I also understand that America gave me something Germany never did. America showed me that enemies can become something else, that people can change, that kindness is not weakness. I wish to be part of a country that believes these things, even if that country does not always live up to its own beliefs. Morrison was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. I will forward your request to the War Department. No promises, but I will recommend approval. You have been a model prisoner, have shown genuine effort to learn English, to understand American values. That counts for something. Thank you, sir. Do not thank me yet. You still need a sponsor, and that will not be easy to find. Carl saluted, left the office, walked back to the barracks with his mind already working on the problem. He needed an American willing to take a chance on a former Nazi officer, willing to see past the uniform to the man underneath, willing to believe in redemption. He knew only one person who might fit that description, Private James Chen, or more specifically, Chen's grandmother, the woman who had sent ingredients for the feast, who had taught her grandson that feeding people was how you showed humanity, who believed in second chances. Carl wrote a letter that night, in his careful improving English, addressed to Mrs. Chen in Chicago. He explained who he was, what he was asking, why he believed he deserved consideration. He did not minimize his service to Germany, did not pretend he was innocent, but he also explained what he had learned, how American kindness had changed him, how he wanted to spend his remaining years proving worthy of that kindness. He gave the letter to James, asked him to include it with his next letter home. James read it, nodded slowly. I will send it, but I cannot promise anything. My family has suffered because Americans cannot tell Chinese from Japanese. They may not want to help German soldier. I understand, Carl said, but I must try. 2 weeks later, James received a response from his grandmother. The letter was in Chinese. He translated it aloud for Carl. His grandmother wrote that she would sponsor Carl, that the Golden Phoenix restaurant needed help with equipment, repair, and kitchen maintenance, that she believed everyone deserved a second chance, that America was built on people who had fled their past to build better futures. She wrote, tell this German officer that I will help him, not because he deserves it, not because he has earned it, but because kindness plants seeds, and we never know which seeds will grow into trees that give shade to future generations. Carl listened to the translation with tears running down his face. When James finished, Carl could not speak, could only nod. The gratitude was too large for words, but there was one more transformation that needed to happen before Carl could leave Camp Allegiance. One more bridge that needed to be built. Sergeant Bull Henderson found Carl in the recreation room 3 days before the first group of prisoners was scheduled for repatriation. Carl was reading a newspaper, practicing English. Bull stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked over, sat down across from Carl. Richter? Carl looked up. Sergeant Henderson. Bull was silent for a moment, his jaw worked. This was difficult for him. Heard you are staying, becoming American. That is my hope, yes. Bull nodded, looked down at his hands. I want to say something, and it is hard, so just listen. Carl set down the newspaper. Waited. I hated you boys when you got here. All of you. My brother died at Kasserine Pass, killed by German artillery. I blamed every German soldier. Wanted you all to suffer. Wanted you to know what it felt like to lose someone you loved. He paused, took a breath. Then Private Chen made that feast, and I watched you men cry over sweet and sour pork. Watched you remember what it felt like to be cared for. And I realized something. You were not the men who killed my brother. You were just other soldiers caught up in something bigger than yourselves. My brother would have done the same in your place. Fought for his country, believed what he was told, died for beliefs that maybe were not as true as he thought. Bull met Carl's eyes. What I am trying to say is I was wrong to hate you, wrong to want you to suffer. You are not my enemy. You are just another man trying to survive a world that does not make sense. So I am sorry for being hard on you, for treating you like you were less than human. He extended his hand across the table. Carl stared at the hand, then took it. The grip was firm, brief, but genuine. Thank you, Sergeant. Your words mean more than you know. Bull stood. Good luck in America. You work hard, you will do fine. And if anyone gives you trouble for being German, you tell them, Bull Henderson says you are all right. He walked away. Carl sat alone in the recreation room, holding a newspaper he could no longer read through the tears in his eyes. An American soldier whose brother had been killed by Germans had just apologized to him, had extended friendship, had blessed his future in this country. If that was possible, then anything was possible. Time moved differently after the war ended. Days blurred together, paperwork was processed, repatriation ships were scheduled. Most prisoners prepared to return to whatever remained of their homes. A small group, 9 men total, had requested permission to stay, to seek immigration status, to try to build new lives in America. Carl was one of them. He spent his remaining weeks at Camp Allegiance studying English, learning about American civics, preparing for the citizenship test he would eventually need to pass. James Chen helped him. Brought him books from the camp library, corrected his pronunciation, explained idioms and cultural references that made no sense to a German mind. They became improbably friends, not in the way men who share a common background become friends, but in the way men who have witnessed each other's vulnerability become friends. They had seen each other at low points, had offered kindness without expectation of return, had chosen to believe in each other's capacity for growth. In late June, Carl was transferred to a displaced persons processing center in New York. His immigration paperwork was being reviewed. Mrs. Chen had submitted all required sponsor documents. The process would take months, maybe years, but it was moving forward. Before he left Camp Allegiance, Carl found James one last time. They stood outside the barracks in morning light. Birds sang in nearby trees. The air smelled of cut grass and possibility. "Thank you," Carl said. His English was much improved now, nearly fluent. "For the food, for the kindness, for seeing me as human when I did not see myself that way." James shook his head. "You do not need to thank me. Just live well. Be good American. That will be thanks enough." They shook hands. Then impulsively, Carl pulled James into a brief embrace, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Enemy officer embracing American guard, but they were not enemy and guard anymore. They were something else, something new. Carl stepped back. "I will make you proud, I promise." "You already have," James said. Carl climbed onto the transport truck, watched Camp Allegiance disappear into the distance, watched Pennsylvania roll past the windows, headed toward New York, toward processing, toward a future he could not predict, but was choosing to believe in. Behind him in the camp that had been his prison and his salvation, James Chen stood and watched the truck disappear, then turned back to the kitchen. There were still prisoners to feed, still men who needed to be reminded that they were human, that they mattered, that the world still contained people who cared. The feast on February 19th had been one stone dropped into still water, but the ripples were spreading, further than either man could see, into a future where enemies would become friends, where former Nazis would advocate for democracy, where the values America proclaimed would be proven true, not through force of arms, but through force of character. The war was over, but the real victory was just beginning. 10 years passed like pages turning in a book Carl could not put down. In February of 1955, Carl Richter stood in the kitchen of the Golden Phoenix restaurant in Chicago. He was 42 years old now, an American citizen for 3 years, married to a German-American woman named Helen who had lost her own family in the war. They had 2 children, David age 6, Sarah age 4, both born in America, both speaking English without accents. Carl had become the restaurant's manager and chief mechanic. He had rebuilt the kitchen ventilation system, upgraded the refrigeration, installed equipment that made Apor shake her head in amazement and say in Cantonese that this German had hands blessed by the kitchen gods. Tonight was special, the 10th anniversary of the feast. James Chen had organized a reunion, invited everyone who had been part of that day. Some could not come, some had died, but those who remained were gathering. Lieutenant Morrison arrived first, retired now, ranching in Texas. His hair had gone gray, but his handshake remained firm. "Hauptmann, sorry, Mr. Richter, still getting used to that." Carl smiled. "Lieutenant Morrison, I think we can drop the formalities. Call me Carl." Bull Henderson came next, brought his wife and teenage son. Bull had put on weight, softened around the edges, but when he saw Carl, his eyes filled with tears. They embraced without words. 10 years of letters between them had built a friendship that war could never have created. Werner Schmidt arrived from New York. He had stayed in America too, worked as a baker, married. "Hauptmann, I still think about that spring roll. Best thing I ever tasted." Klaus Muller came from Pittsburgh, carpenter, built houses for returning veterans. Strange is it not, we build homes for men who fought us, but they are good homes. Solid. Maybe that is how we earn forgiveness. One house at a time. James Chen entered last with Ah Por. The old woman was 80 now, moved slowly, but her eyes remained sharp. She walked straight to Carl, looked up at him, then without warning pulled him down and kissed both his cheeks. "You are good boy," she said in broken English. "Good American. I am proud." Carl could not speak, could only nod. They recreated the feast, the same recipes, the same care. Sweet and sour pork, fried rice, spring rolls. This time there were no guards and prisoners, only friends, only family chosen rather than born. After the meal, Morrison stood, raised his glass. 10 years ago, Private Chen did something unprecedented. He treated enemies like human beings. And look what happened. Former Nazis became Americans. Former guards became friends. Hatred became love. If that is not the American dream, I do not know what is. They drank. And Carl thought about the journey. From Panzer commander to restaurant manager. From enemy to American. From hatred to hope. 8 years later, Carl Richter stood before the United States Senate. The senators had invited him to testify about prisoner of war reintegration programs, about how America could help former enemies become allies, about what had worked in the aftermath of World War II and what lessons might apply to the Cold War. Carl told them everything: the feast, the kindness, the letter about his family, the Holocaust photographs, the choice to stay, Mrs. Chen's generosity, Bull Henderson's forgiveness, the 10 years building a life in Chicago. When he finished, the chamber was silent. Senator Fulbright leaned forward. "Mr. Richter, you describe American treatment of German prisoners as instrumental in winning the peace after the war. Can you elaborate?" Carl nodded. "Senator, I returned to Germany in 1955 to visit what remained of Dresden. I met former soldiers who had been prisoners of the Russians. They described beatings, starvation, forced labor. Many died. Those who survived were filled with hatred. They wanted revenge. They became problems for the new German government. Then I met former soldiers who had been held in American camps. They described adequate food, medical care, education programs. They learned English, learned trades, and most importantly, they learned Americans were not monsters. When America started the Marshall Plan, began rebuilding Germany, these former prisoners became advocates. They told their neighbors Americans are good people. They helped us. We should cooperate. That cooperation, Senator, is how you win peace after war, not through more violence, through showing former enemies that your values are worth adopting, through demonstrating that strength includes mercy, that victory includes generosity. I am proof of this. I fought for evil men pursuing evil goals, but Americans treated me with dignity, fed me when I was hungry, gave me hope when I had none, sponsored me when I had nothing. And now I am American. I vote, I pay taxes, I raise my children to love this country, not because you defeated me, because you redeemed me. Senator Mansfield spoke next. "What would you say is the most important lesson from your experience?" Carl thought for a long moment. "Enemies do not stay enemies forever, but how you treat them when they are enemies determines what they become when the enmity ends." Private James Chen understood this. His grandmother understood this. They planted seeds of kindness in February 1945. 18 years later, those seeds have grown into friendship, into loyalty, into love of American values. If America wants to win the Cold War, do not just build weapons, build relationships. Do not just defeat enemies, transform them, show them that your way of life is better not by telling them, but by living it so purely that they want to join you. The testimony lasted 3 hours. When Carl stepped down, reporters surrounded him. Cameras flashed, but all Carl could think about was getting back to Chicago, to Helen, to David and Sarah, to the Golden Phoenix where James would be waiting with a pot of tea and questions about how it went. 22 years later, James Chen sat in the kitchen of the Golden Phoenix, now run by his daughter Lily. He was 68 years old, retired officially, but he still came in most mornings, could not stay away. Cooking was in his blood. The young woman with the camera adjusted the lighting. Mr. Chen, can you tell me about the feast you prepared in 1945? James smiled. 40 years. 40 years since that February morning. Since he had decided to cook for enemies. Since he had dropped a stone into still water. I just wanted to show them kindness, he said quietly. My grandmother taught me that when you cook for someone, you tell them they matter, that they are worth your time, your effort, your care. I thought the German prisoners needed to know that somebody saw them as human, not as enemies, not as numbers, as men. I did not know it would change Carl's life, did not know he would stay in America, become my friend, become my children's Uncle Carl. I just knew it was the right thing to do. Carl Richter passed away last month, the interviewer said gently. Did you get to see him before the end? James nodded. His eyes were wet. I was with him. At the hospital. His children were there. His grandchildren. He looked at me and said, James, that sweet and sour pork you made, that was the best meal of my life. Not because of the food, because of what it meant. Because it told me I could be more than what I had been. Thank you for that. Those were almost his last words. The interviewer waited. Let James collect himself. Carl's grandson, James continued, his name is Michael. He serves in the United States Army. Fourth-generation American, he calls himself. Half German, half Irish. All American. He came to the Golden Phoenix last week. Brought his unit. They wanted to taste the sweet and sour pork that changed his grandfather's life. I made it for them, same recipe, Pour's recipe, and I thought about how one meal in 1945 created ripples that are still spreading. Carl's grandchildren, my grandchildren. They will never know the war we knew. They will never understand what it meant to see enemies become friends. But they will taste this food. And maybe they will remember that kindness matters, that how we treat people, even enemies, defines who we are. The camera kept rolling, and James Chen, 68 years old, stood at the stove where his grandmother had once taught him to cook. His hands still knew the movements, the precise cuts, the careful balance of flavors, the sweet and sour, the harmony of opposites. He cooked not because he had to, but because some things were worth preserving. Some recipes carried more than flavor. They carried memory. They carried values. They carried the proof that enemies could become family if someone was brave enough to feed them. The Golden Phoenix still operates today, run by James Chen's great-granddaughter. On the wall hangs a photograph from 1955. Carl Richter and James Chen arms around each other's shoulders laughing. Beside it, a framed menu from that reunion dinner. And beneath both a small plaque. In memory of Hauptmann Carl Richter, 1913 to 1993, and Sergeant James Chen, 1917 to 2005. Two soldiers who proved that the greatest American weapon is not military might, but the transformative power of kindness. May we never forget. The sweet and sour pork remains on the menu, the recipe unchanged, and sometimes on quiet evenings the staff swears they can smell ginger and garlic in the air even when nothing is cooking. As if the ghosts of two old friends have returned to the kitchen where their unlikely friendship began, where enemies became brothers, where hatred became love, where one meal changed not just two lives but the course of history itself, because that is what America means, not the America that bombs and conquers, but the America that feeds and forgives, that gives second chances, that believes people can change. That is the America worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. That is the America that Carl Richter learned about on February 19, 1945, when a Chinese-American soldier served him sweet and sour pork and said without words, "You are human. You are worth caring for. You matter." And 48 years later, when Carl closed his eyes for the last time, that was the America he still believed in. The ripples continue.